Dr. Roger Miles, welcome to the Fall Forward podcast. It's wonderful to have you here today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, Steve. We look forward to this.
Well, we got to see each other last week in the flesh because you were hosting a session for our Blend members in London. So thank you for that. And we were bringing our members to talk about risk. But before we delve into risk, which you have a career, a back catalogue of experience for us to delve into in that area, and obviously lots of others, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, Roger, to the members listening, to the wider audiences listening. Give us a bit of background to you, what brought you on this wonderful journey to where you are today, and then we'll delve into the topic.
Steve, sure, thank you. And the thread that kind of connects all of these things becomes clearer in hindsight, funnily enough. So if you told me at the outset of my career that I was going to be doing this, I would have raised an eyebrow rather. So I started by training. I mean, actually, I had an English degree and then a linguistics master's, then trained as an accountant, and practiced for a decade or so in investor relations, which is, as you know, kind of specialized stakeholder relations, looking at people who are chasing for return on capital. Worked for various industry organizations representing the financial sector. Did a few years with the civil service, looking at risk communications in kind of civil and military situations where populations are under stress. Then took myself back to school and took my doctorate in behavioral science, looking at the design of rules, and wrote my PhD research around the failure of the banking system to deal with bad behavior within itself. So I looked particularly at the role of the chief risk officer and how that was compromised between what the rules said should be happening and what actually happens. And I still use this phrase all the time, what actually happens, because there is in life this great gap between what we'd like to believe in terms of how the systems are designed and the things that people really do. I've always been fascinated, partly from the literature background, by sort of the study of personality and how people engage with different things because of their own backgrounds. So, and I just love the idea that there are human explanations for why rules break down. People don't set out to be bad, but they kind of go off the rails in a variety of interesting ways because rules are badly designed, toxic culture in workplaces, all that stuff. So that kind of research I've now been doing for more than 15 years, meaning taking people aside gently at board level or managers running a business, typically in a financial firm, looking at why their attempts to control risk are not working. I particularly focus in this thing called conduct risk, which is really bankers' jargon for how we behave. And there's an incredibly clumsy phrase doing the rounds now called non-financial misconduct, which basically just means casually obnoxious behavior, which anyone who's ever worked with a casually obnoxious person in their workplace will recognize can create all sorts of spin-off toxic effects. So that's kind of it. I've written a few books. I'm a core content writer for a couple of training organizations, including a thing called UK Finance, which is the Bankers Collective Association. You will have seen some of my stuff, possibly without realizing it, if you've watched one or two TV dramas where psychopathic behavior features prominently. But let's not get sidetracked down that rabbit hole. Let's talk about risk now.
Oh, I feel like we might have to come back there later, Roger, if you've been consulting and giving advice on that. It's always fun for listeners and to delve into. So you said you wouldn't have expected to have a career in risk or so closely in this kind of area. What drew you to risk, and why spend 17, 18, 20 plus years in that area? What was it that inspired you to impact that area?
So the timeline actually, so I picked up my PhD the year of the banking crisis, and I had not predicted there was going to be this crisis. And so sure, one can almost kind of divide things into before and after that because the world changed in a big way. But there is a common thread, which is this fascination of why people do what they do. And actually, you could argue that reading a good novel or seeing a good play teaches you about the human condition. So a good writer will be observing why people behave as they do. So going right back into classical history and the early modern period when the novel was developing, you can absolutely see that this observation of human behavior and motivation is a key part of why people are fascinated in reading a good story. Then again, Hollywood movies as well. A good film will have found a premise that we're intrigued by how this lead character behaves, and we want to watch them for 2 hours to see how they cope with stuff being thrown at them. And you could call that risk response. It's kind of the same thing. So there is a continuity between this fascination with behavior in storytelling and the science of human behavior, in which I'm formally qualified. So I'm actually a doctor of risk, specifically around looking at rule design and the cognitive psychology of how people make sense of risk. So sense making, risk perception, how the brain works, processing signals of risk, and all of that stuff.
So why is it then that some people have a we talk about risk appetite a lot in the world of leadership. Why is it, Roger, that some people have a higher or lower appetite for risk? But then also there's an element of having an appetite, but there's also an element of being able to manage that risk. Talk to us about what you typically
Sure,
see.
there's a bunch of actually, yeah, there's some interlocking things going on there. So to an
Yeah.
extent, people have an innate setting. It is absolutely true. I don't know if you're a podcast fan, apart from producing your own. I'm a big fan of the Rest is History podcast, where they're doing a series on various leaders at the moment, like Napoleon and Nelson, and some of the classical generals. It's very clear that there's a certain type of leader behavior epitomized by someone like Nelson, where risk taking. So, did he actually go and kill a polar bear on an Arctic expedition? No, but it makes it's a great character story. Not readers that I'm saying we want to go and kill polar bears, by the way, but as an example of sort of early 19th century heroic behavior. So there clearly are people with a higher appetite for, let us call it, the thrill of being alive. I'm always interested when I'm interviewing my senior people and doing board meetings. What do people do when they're not in the workplace? So do we have any base jumpers? Do we have any dangerous athletes? I shared a platform last month at a defence conference with the head of marketing for Red Bull Dangerous Sports, who is himself a qualified ice climber. Who knew there was such a thing? And there clearly are people whose sense of excitement, sentience, engaging with the world needs them to be taking rather more extreme risks than most of us. By the way, I live a fairly quiet personal life, but I do believe that you should put people out of their comfort zone habitually. I think it's a really important thing. And don't, for example, teach your children never to talk to strangers, because they will never acquire the cognitive skill to understand when a stranger's conversation is a bit off. Do talk to strangers in the bus queue, in the supermarket, whatever, when your parents are around, just to keep an eye on it, because one of the most important things a child can learn is a normal conversation with an adult, because then you'll have a benchmark to judge an abnormal conversation against. So when some creepy character tries to misbehave, you can see that it doesn't fit it doesn't fit in the corridor of normal behavior. So taking risks, absolutely essential. You cannot have a risk-free life, by the way, even if you stay in bed and don't get up. If you've looked for the statistics on bedsheet entanglement risk, um, actually, every single thing you do has risk attached to it. One of my favorite indexes for this is by a guy called David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge, one of the greatest statisticians in our age, by the way, who invented a thing called the micro-mort, which is an index of, for every 60 seconds of a specific activity, how likely are you to die during that activity? And he uses the example of driving from London to Edinburgh. If you do it on a motorbike versus in a car or a bus, clearly the motorbike option is by far the most risky. So your micro morts for a trip to London to Edinburgh, I forget what the index is. It's like 100 versus 5 or 10 for doing it by public transport. A problem that we all have, though, is that the way we make sense of risk is incredibly personal. And we tend to overestimate what I'd call tall, thin risks, so improbable but catastrophic if they happen. And the classic example of that is a piece of work done by Paul Slovic, I think about 30-something years ago now, where he compared people's estimate of getting killed by something they'd read about in the news, like a catastrophic train crash or a terrorist bomb, versus will I actually die of heart disease or advanced diabetes, or one of the things that actually is medically most likely to kill you. And people consistently overweight these sort of exceptional, terrifying risks and underweight the mundane stuff that is actually harmful. What you could say about risk appetite, therefore, is that leaders going out and actively seeking risk taking, if they're doing the right sort of thing, are tuning up their own sense of risk engagement. And I think that's perfectly okay. Whether I'd want to share a boardroom with a CEO who is a habitual kind of base jumper, someone who jumps off tall buildings with a parachute, I'm not sure. There's a bit of a grey area there.
I think there's when we're speaking to members, and I think when we were together last week, there's definitely this friction
Yeah.
that exists in organizations between the role of risk in an organization and the role of innovation and development and growth, and the failures, of course, that come with those things. How can executives, how can leaders create that environment where you have that healthy balance between the two? And what have you seen, or maybe that people have been successful in enabling that culture?
Yeah, I mean, let's start off by saying not to take action is itself often amplifying a risk. And
Mm.
also, let's just be clear about this word risk. An awful lot of people use the word risk as shorthand for hazard, which is not the same thing. And if we're being careful about how we use the word risk, it's the balance of hazard and opportunity. So it's that decision point in the middle that says, look, here's the profit or the potential upside of doing something, and here are the things that could go wrong, which we're going to try and manage and mitigate. So I'm always a little bit more careful not to use the word risk casually to mean the bad stuff. It should be about decision making and balancing the good and the bad possible outcomes. Um, People who do this well are the ones who have the best conversations with their frontline staff. It's very clear to me. Organizations that break down tend to have an over reliance on what I might call virtual risk management. So, risk modeling. In banking, we talk about models arbitrage, playing off one type of risk modeling against another in order to see which outcome is going to be the best. I'm kind of fundamentalist about this. I think you need to get people in conversation with other people. So, your team, uh, you asked a little while back about risk taking. It's so important to get a sense of the personality of the people that you work with in order to understand their appetite for risk, and not just risk appetite in the sense of rushing out and challenging things, but also just day to day. Do they make a point of getting good information? Do they make good decisions based on acquiring knowledge from different sources, and all of this kind of thing? And I think a lot of careless risk taking is often the result of a feeling that if you just kind of rush ahead, gathering the minimum of information, that somehow having forward momentum is okay. And the real skill of leadership is knowing when to balance information gathering with decision making. And again, to be clear, information is always incomplete. There will never be a point at which you have all the information you need to make a decision. So a good leader is one who intuitively knows, okay, we know what we need to know. No. But they also don't go the other way of saying, well, of course I know what I'm doing because I'm the leader. That's a sort of an overconfidence bias, which we often see leading to terrible failure. Examples of good leaders, yeah, for sure. I mean, I've worked closely with bank boards now for getting on for 20 years, and absolutely no doubt in my mind, the best ones to work with, um, not just as an advisor, but actually watching their own staff responding to them, are these people who've got that skill of walking the floor and just having an adult to adult conversation, not a patronizing sort of I'm the boss type conversation, but just, I've hired you because you're a clever person, so I'd be really interested, I'd be genuinely interested in what you have to say about where we are and what you're doing, anything that's worrying you, that kind of pastoral come anecdote gathering conversation. There are some leaders who are just naturally really good at that. The problem in many industries, particularly financial services, I have to say, is people get promoted for technical skill. They're really good at financial engineering and contract design and risk modeling and all that stuff. They're not so good at the people stuff. Now, the contrast to that is something like the UK civil service, which is really interesting to me, having done a stint in banking and then in the civil service. They have this quite specific career development plan where with every seniority grade you rise, you specifically have to commit to doing more people management skills training and work, more time actually dealing with people rather than just the models and the contracts and so on. So by sector, I think there's quite a while. I'd be really interested to hear from colleagues at Blend, actually, how they see their own particular sectors at striking this balance of people versus, let's call it, technical skill.
Yeah, we see examples of that everywhere in life, don't we? Actually, and I think of it because it was the weekend just yesterday. Think of the footballing world. How many times do you see the best footballers being terrible managers? And it's a cliche to say so, but it's such a visible example of exactly that coming to life. The other
I mean,
thing
that's
that
a
you met.
brilliant. This is why I like Blend, Steve, because we get analogies from all over the place. And yeah, I'm not a big football follower, just to be clear, but it's absolutely obvious that there's no kind of automatic skills transfer between being good on the field and good in that specific leadership situation. One reason, by the way, I like working with military people is that they tend to be quite good at that transition. Because when you are working at the sharp end, whether it's kind of repairing the bridge in the middle of a town that's just been bombed, or kind of flying high jeopardy surveillance flights over occupied territory, all these things, you absolutely have to work as a team with your colleagues. And so team integration and team leadership is so intrinsic to life in the forces generally, that they tend to be very good people managers, problem solvers, lateral thinkers, all of that.
I saw Simon Sinek recently talking about the role of trust in that environment. How important then is the role of trust in when you're dealing and managing with risk as a board? How important is that element in that conversation?
Yeah, pretty key. I mean, let's talk about a couple of aspects of that. I think one of the issues where we see breakdown with between, let's call them just leaders and the rest, whether you prefer the workforce, staff, the rest of the people. Um, leaders will, there's a very understandable tendency to want to kind of insulate yourself as a leader and just sort of acquire information remotely and get it reported through middle management. Middle management, of course, always have a perverse incentive to spin the transfer of information to give it the most favorable presentation to senior leaders. And that's why a good senior leader will do this thing of anecdote gathering and going straight to the front line and listening to what people on, as it were, the production line or the customer facing or the helpline, the help desks are hearing. Most people working in an organization are not going to work feeling kind of completely bored. You get up in the morning feeling you want to do something useful. And one of the best things a good employer can do and a good leader can do is recognize that feeling that you want your day to be valuable. And I'm going to try not to use too much jargon here, but there is this quite important phrase, intrinsic motivation. You want people to do stuff because they feel good and comfortable doing it. People don't wake up in the morning thinking, what evil plan can I execute? Well, I mean, a very few of them do, but most of us don't do that. They come into work, in 3D or virtually, wanting to feel that they're doing something productive and maybe ultimately helpful to the wider world, not just kind of earning money for themselves and their employers. And I think the best thing a leader can do is show people context of what's the value of your work specifically in the wider setting of whether it's market making, helping with trade, creating employment, helping people realize their dreams, whatever it is. There's a fascinating subfield of corporate mission statements, um, which is highly contentious, and I don't want to get into a lot, but a couple of my favorite ones are the Disney Corporation, which talks about, giving people joy through storytelling. I can't remember the exact wording of it, but absolutely, what's wrong with that? What a wonderful thing to do. And SpaceX, who again I shared a conference platform with quite recently. I mean, an amazing organization. Whatever you think of the politics, again, let's leave that aside for a second. SpaceX have this extraordinary mission statement to make mankind an interplanetary species. And you sort of think, what? That's talking of stretch goals. That's quite a thing, actually. And to be fair, and just parking SpaceX aside for a second, what is it that makes the human race interesting and different, perhaps, from most of the rest of the animal kingdom? It's this capacity to rationalize, to think forward, to talk about the past and the future, to tell stories, to make sense of the risks that we just took, but also pulling all that together, this extraordinary capacity we have for curiosity. Now, I completely get, we all watch Attenborough and we see pictures of various other creatures doing exotic things with, you know, prototype tool making and sort of communicating through oceans and all the rest of it. But humanity still remains the one species that has this extraordinary capacity for curiosity and then communicating and sharing what it has discovered about its risk taking. So why did the explorers in the first and second millenniums actually go out across the edge of the world, not knowing whether they'd come back? Why did we go to the moon? Why do we constantly push the boundaries of the possible, to try to discover more about the world and make sense of how we live and how we live together? There's this amazing human drive to make sense of things. And the reason I advise senior leaders to go and get anecdotes is that anecdote telling, storytelling, around the coffee machine or in the pub or whatever, is absolutely part of the human experience of how we make sense of risk taking and the business of being alive. So gathering anecdotes is fundamental to understanding what people are thinking on the front line in any organization. And again, I talk about, government actually can be quite good at this, military people quite good at this, some professions spectacularly good at this. I'm not going to pick out any in particular. Um, what I've seen working in, a dozen different sectors over the years is that some sectors have really well developed tools for this kind of thing, whereas others have not really given it very much thought. And what I love about the blend approach is this absolute broad church of we can learn from each other's experiences doing quite different things. So I come back to this idea that humanity as animals makes sense of their place in the world by telling stories to each other. And that actually is a huge part of risk taking and sense making around how we do risks. And a good leader will absolutely understand that soliciting, listening to those stories, making people comfortable, addressing them as adults rather than as children, not patronizing them, is such an important part of intelligence gathering. Throughout history, the greatest leaders, by the way, have often been compulsive anecdote gatherers. And in the modern age, you can look at somebody like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, or in the UK, Anita Roddick, all compulsive anecdote gatherers and better leaders because of it.
So I think we've quite very much articulated this idea of as leaders, let's get out there, let's get to the front line, let's build that understanding of really what's happening so that when we're making those judgments around risk, you have that intuition that we have as humans to do so.
It is
How
absolutely a
about,
balance of rationality and intuition. Yes, yes.
yeah, and how about then, I suppose, if I'm also thinking with the functional hat that we have, what about the techniques, if you like, or the risk strategies or frameworks that you've seen that go hand in hand with that? What should leaders be considering to balance, if you like, that intuition with good framework or good
Sure. I
process?
mean,
What have you seen that
the
works well there?
temptation, yeah, no, absolutely. The temptation ever since the dawn of the industrial age, which of course coincided with the Enlightenment and this idea that there's a rational explanation for everything. What to me is striking is reading the life stories of some of the greatest scientists. And you look at someone like Newton, who's responsible for putting a lot of the big building blocks in place for understanding of the physical world. They were deeply spiritual people as well. They understood that there are, mystery and wonder, or whatever you want to call it, is a really important part of the human experience. And actually, far from reducing everything to cold rationality, a respect for the intuitive, the respect for being awed by something, or just having a sort of emotional response to something, is absolutely key. So it's the balancing of these two. What I worry a little bit in this age of big data and AI and advanced risk modeling, there's a great tendency, and again I speak from having both feet in the financial sector for the past decade, that there's a real fallacy, I'm afraid, a sort of belief that more information equals better decision making. Well, to an extent, yeah, but you also have to slightly step back and look at the bigger picture, look at the strategic picture. Not just what is the information saying, but how are people making sense of it? How are people responding to what's going on? One of the models that I teach in my corporate and academic work is a kind of 5 hot buttons model that says, you can upset your stakeholders broadly in one of 5 or a combination of more than one of these different ways around making them feel overloaded or uncomfortable with forced change or simply anxious or sort of unhappy about perceived inequity, unfairness, or that you've kind of crossed an invisible line that you've not noticed, that public opinion about the acceptability of what you're doing has changed. History is full of these examples of industries that collapsed because public opinion sort of turned against them. Things like whaling, fur trading, and tobacco production, dare I say, and we got any good tobacco people on the broadcast. Society kind of moves in and out of support and then dissent and criticism for certain types of human activity. And this is one of the things I love about this field is this is incredibly dynamic, constantly changing. And you cannot reduce risk simply to a mathematical series of certainties about, hitting the numbers of risk taking and return. I completely accept it in something highly kind of technocratic like derivatives trading, say, where it's very largely about the numbers. You can shut down a lot of the uncertainty and really focus quite tightly on a numerical risk, but it's never quite free of that human quality. And again, not to bang on about it, why did we have the financial crash in 2008? Precisely because the market makers simultaneously kind of turned around to each other and said, hang on a minute, this is unsustainable. It wasn't modeled into the risk paradigm of the time. And actually, the fact that it wasn't modeled into it is one of the reasons the crash was so extreme. You could see it as a collective failure of nerve. And in that sense, it was a classic bubble. It goes, you can look at many, many bubbles back through history, things like the tulip mania of the 1700s. People will trade at a price for as long as they think somebody else is going to buy from them when they need to sell. But if suddenly all the buyers disappear from the market because there's been a complete panic of, hang on a minute, maybe none of this is worth what we think it is, which is exactly what happened in 2008, by the way. That is psychological. That is not risk assessment. That's not mathematical. So it's balancing these two things. And my 5 kind of warning signs of are you about to fall over, or are the wheels about to fall off your enterprise, your organization, absolutely explains why there are share price crashes, why governments fall. We could talk about any one of the major political changes that's just happened or is indeed just happening through elections. It has a great deal to do with leaders not taking the time to understand what voters are concerned about. Let me just say that. I have
Yeah.
to be very
What are
careful not to
those?
take a party political line. Yeah.
All parties are welcome, Roger. We welcome everyone in Blend, as you know. What are those 5 things? What are the 5? You mentioned the
Yeah,
5 kind
let me
of
just track back
points.
through them. So, um, overloading a system. So, and this applies obviously in a way, this kind of fans out into a whole stack of other questions, but just to kind of pull it into a simple model. So, overload can include simply trying to shove more products down the pipe than your customers are willing to receive. So, overextending the brand. It can also include something simple like trying to push too much throughput through a factory which simply doesn't have the system to handle it, or indeed overloading any sort of production system. Don't start me on the NHS, for example. Here is a system which has a finite capacity, which probably is overstretched by a number of factors. So there's overstretch and overload, but typically at ground level, people feeling that you're asking too much of them. So that classic thing of sort of recruiting 3 people and then firing one of them and redistributing the third person's job between the other 2 is a very simple, it might make sense on paper, but you can be pretty sure that the 2 people who are having to do now 1.5 jobs each, even if they said, yes, boss, I'll do that, are not necessarily feeling very comfortable about that development. So it's pretty easy to understand. There's deep psychology, there's many decades worth of research behind these things, but actually the principles are pretty simple to get your head around. Second one is forced change. So novelty. I'm not saying people reject novelty, although Let's take a look at what's been happening to the Jaguar brand this weekend. There's been a lot of coverage of why Jaguar is rebranding and has stopped making cars for a year whilst it retools to create a new generation of cars. I initially, like most people, looked at that rebrand and thought they've gone mad. What's this kind of aliens on Mars? And no cars in sight. What's all that about? And then I thought, hang on a minute, this is a brand which historically had a reputation for innovation. So in 1937 and again in 1947 and again in 1961, this is a company, Jaguar, which came out with absolutely mold-breaking, jaw-droppingly advanced, whether it was because of low price or the design, cars which made people think, wow, it's almost like the aliens have landed, actually. Here's a car which we've never seen before, whether it's the E-Type or the XK120 or whatever. So Jaguar, to be fair, in its own time, and if you kind of strip away the oily rag, wistful old men, kind of classic car crowd, and you look at the impact that that innovation made at the time, I'm thinking 1947 particularly, nobody had seen anything like the XK120, and it's just kind of wow, this is what we want. We just didn't know we wanted it. And again with the E-Type, which is perhaps a little closer to people's living memory now, here was a car which was fundamentally unlike anything which had been done before. So you could argue that in the novelty market, Jaguar is simply saying, we're just calming down, drawing breath for a year to make space for something completely mold breaking, something completely different. So you can manage expectation around novelty. Clearly, some people are going to be upset at the time. The other aspect of new is the shock of finding out new information about something that you didn't know before was happening. And this is the classic definition of, cover up and scandal. So whether it's something like the post office, the kind of mess that the Church of England is going through at the moment, or I don't know, Wirecard, Silicon Valley Bank, any of these brands that's had difficulty with maybe an audit calling out that actually the systems were not working as people assumed that they should. I did some very interesting work with the National Audit Office of our government in the UK earlier this year, looking at how difficult it is for an auditor to say, actually, I don't understand what's going on here. You need to explain it to me better. And often a classic sign that things are going wrong is that people within the organization are themselves unable to explain why things are not quite working as they should be. So that brings me to the third button, which is this idea of dread. And this can be like existential or physical anxiety. I'll take a simple flippant example of that. When back in the noughties, a lot of big organizations started flipping from fixed desks, as in a desk with your name on it, to hot desking, which is kind of like a combative thing where you had to fight for a place to work. One thing about the human animal is it's pretty territorial. People quite like to have the idea that they've got a footprint somewhere, whether it's their home or their workplace. Taking away that footprint, for some people, actually quite a lot of people, creates a sense of, kicking away a support system. Possibly even that my employer doesn't even trust me sufficiently to give me a place to work. I'm exaggerating slightly just to make the point. The idea that if I'm not even going to give you a fixed workplace, then maybe I don't trust you enough to sort of give you a long-term employment contract. I mean, another contractual version of that would be 0 hours contract. It's kind of, okay, so what, am I an employee or not an employee? I'm not very clear here. So those are existential versions of the risk. Obviously, physical risk, quite simple to understand. There are many industries in which physical hazard is part of the deal. So if you're working in, I know, deep sea oil drilling or chemical production or whatever, you kind of understand that there's a catastrophic risk, which is very much part of the day-to-day work, and you take clearly different measures to mitigate that risk. Fourth one is unfairness. This is the idea that some of the people are doing all the work, but then some other people are getting all the benefit of the work. I don't really need to go into that, right? So the sense that there's a group of people with privilege and then a group of other people who are actually doing all the work. And privilege obviously extends again, in my home patch, financial markets to something like insider dealing or Nepo baby promotion or, all that stuff. The fifth one to me is often the most interesting. It's this completely invisible boundary that I tend to call social proof. Although social proof, again, if we've got any behavioral scientists listening, I know people, social proof is a sort of general category for a whole load of things. Roughly speaking, social proof is what do I think and what does the person at the next desk or my neighbour or my family or my mates in the pub or whatever, what do we collectively think about? Are we okay with this? And again, this is what loses leaders elections. What gets chief executives fired. It's what loses general elections, particularly. It's when you turn around, you have a quiet conversation with your gang, your family, your neighbours, your workmates, whatever, and people are sort of saying, "Yeah, do you know what? I'm not really sure they've got it any longer. I'm not sure it is okay. I'm actually not. I'm not okay with the way this is working out. It's not just me, is it? Do you think the same?" And people kind of gather, risk taking and decision making and opinion gathering is hugely organic. We are, as human animals, we actually evolved to work cooperatively before we became combative. There's all right, two major theories of evolution about Darwin on the one hand and the kind of hive mind, collective nomad behavior. I'm more of the sort of nomad tendency. Human animals, when we lived nomadically, 100,000, 200,000 years ago, we work better by cooperating in tribes. It's only when we started planting crops and managing land and then having to defend that against the next guy that people got territorial and belligerent and sort of fighting in organized groups. Prior to that, we were much more live and let live. And okay, resources were scarce. I'm not saying nobody ever fought anybody, but there wasn't this kind of organized nation state, property based warfare. And if you look at the track of evolutionary psychology, the brain, I'm not saying we stopped evolving 100,000 years ago, but the brain has not evolved. Evolutionary times are many, many, many millennia. 100,000 years is pretty much the blink of an eye in terms of the evolution of what's going on in your head. We actually are highly social animals. We need to take decisions with reference to each other. And I could argue, just to put out there a slightly controversial conversation starter, that it's when we start believing in our own personal sort of invulnerability or our own rightness that the stuff goes terribly wrong. We used to have a saying in investor relations back when I was doing that in the sort of glory days of the 80s and 90s, when the chairman starts believing their own PR, then you're in trouble. People who have this overconfidence, this unwillingness to kind of check their biases. And I don't, by the way, mean sort of, diversity scorecard biases. Actually, this is more about cognitive, just the processing of information. The biggest human bias is the belief that we're not biased. That's almost universal. This belief that, well, no, I know what I'm doing, you don't, because you're not me. And the problem is in leadership, people kind of go up the up escalator, they get to the boardroom, and there's this sudden need to justify being a senior person. So when we talk about groupthink, a lot of people get groupthink wrong. It's not just a bunch of senior people all saying yes to each other. It actually derives from the behavior of primates where they're grooming each other. Groupthink, like picking fleas off the silverback's back. It's actually about social approval of the status of the group. So saying yeah, when the chief exec expresses some outrageous opinion that actually nobody else on the board agrees with, but they all put their hands up to vote it in, that is signaling that we are kind of reassuring each other about our membership of this group. It's not just willful blindness, which is what people often think groupthink is. It's a much more complex social component than that. How do we get into that? Gosh, biases. Yes.
Well, look, you talked about the five, and I think that's really practical and helpful for our leaders to be thinking about. As
The great thing is, I mean, I've done a couple of
their
books on this, so if you want to go off and find those on Amazon, it's all explained in very plain terms there. The great thing is you can apply absolutely, and by the way, the next book I'm writing at the moment with an American colleague, you can put through this filter, this kind of five-factor filter, absolutely any event of failure of governance or government and always learn something from it. So it's applying what I call a behavioral lens to things which have been classically seen as just failures of risk assessment. And I promise you can learn something about behavioral interaction by applying this lens. in a way that you maybe have never seen reported before, which is why I'm fascinated by all this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like that you brought up the Jaguar example because it's so timely. You could argue
Well,
that
we
if they
like,
did nothing,
there's
that in itself
every
is a
week there's a
risk.
story. That's the other good thing about this is you can apply it absolutely to current events in any sphere.
You sure can. Well, I think for that example, the risk of doing nothing was, of course, they were dying. They've been dying for years. So related to the innovative brand,
Right.
I think
But then,
I'll wait and
Steve,
see. I'll pass my
there's
judgment
also a thing
soon.
called action. Well, I mean, the opposite, and the wonderful thing about this is for every sort of bias at one end of the scale, there's a kind of counter bias at the other. So the opposite of the do nothing, of the like the anchoring, I'm going to stay here bias, is a thing called action bias, which is exactly like it sounds, which is something must be done. So this is something, therefore we're fixing it. This is a classic thing that politicians do. They set up a commission or a panel of investigation or whatever, and it's kind of performative, signaling that we're doing something when actually you're not doing anything. Um, or actually, the other version of action bias is that simply have you considered sitting back and letting things take their course because, in fact, it is going perfectly okay? So, ironically, it's almost like the opposite end of the same bias. There are occasions when what you actually want to do is just stop intervening and let things take their course because it's all going pretty well. But again, it takes a powerfully intuitive leader, so a leader with good risk information, but also good intuition, to know when to say, actually, just hang on, let this one run for another, 6 months, whatever, and maybe it's okay, actually. But that requires a certain courage to say to your shareholders, or in the case of the football manager, to say to your sponsors, actually, it's going to be fine. The team's going to come around. We may have had a losing streak, but we've put the changes in, and it's going to.
One of the things, Roger, we like to do in the podcast is ask our members to pose a question to our hosts. Um, one of the questions actually is a kind of a follow up to the session that we did last week, where one of the questions in the room was talking about the role of AI and risk, because of course, not only can AI itself as a technology be seen as a risk, but of course, it's changing how we measure and manage risk in our organizations. I thought for our broader listeners and broader members across the world, I'd love to, well, the question is, we'd love to get Dr. Rogers' view on the role of AI and risk, because everybody is talking about it.
I have a particular take on this. So my second degree was linguistics, so I'm in the rather unusual position of knowing a bit more about large language models and how they function than a lot of people out there. So I do understand, how the words are crunched and how large language models then generate responses. Having said that, I have absolutely no claim to be an AI expert. To be clear, I'm a cognitive psychologist. I'm a risk person. Um, let's just talk cognitive for the as the starting point of all of this. So a lot of people, when the internet first came along back in I'm going to say the 90s for practical purposes, people started hooking up and being able to extend to send messages to each other. And then we had arguably the internet really came of age, or the World Wide Web and searching came of age when Google made sense of, here's an interface where you can put a plain language question in and get a plain language answer. And we then had this extraordinary decade with social media where everyone was just crazy for, it's like the collective mind of the world is there for all to see. Unfortunately, of course, that created stresses because for all that people, I really believe, I am an optimist, by the way. I do believe that most people are well intended. But if you kind of throw them all into this, it's like a kind of collective open air swimming pool with all of humanity in it, people are going to barge into each other, and it's going to offer the opportunity for people to behave badly and to try to seek advantage over weaker others, and all of those not so good aspects of how we are. On top of that, now we've got AI sitting, and I think two things about AI we particularly need to focus on. One, talking. I mean, by the way, AI is a huge term which covers all sorts of things. So let's just make it slightly more specific about large language modeling and being able to interrogate and get questions from essentially the sum of human knowledge that's out there on the web. Um, First of all, it's a rear view mirror. So there's a research colleague called Shannon Valler, who you may have heard of, who was Google's head of ethics and is now a professor of ethics at Edinburgh. She says AI is a mirror of humanity, but it's like a rear view mirror because all the information it's gathered, pretty obviously, is retrospective. It's stuff that has been done. Um, the other issue with AI is it's not very discriminating. It's kind of an averaging machine. So it'll give you the answer that it thinks on average is the answer most likely to please you, which doesn't mean that it's necessarily true or that it has good citations or that there's a rationale for how it arrived at the decision to give you the answer. So I'm very nervous about AI being tasked with corporate decision making because it's really hard. It's well, actually opaque. It resists explaining the steps that it took to reach a piece of advice. That's because it didn't really take a series of rational steps. It actually just sucked in, all of the information it could find in response to the prompt, and then spat out an average of what it believes will be most pleasing to you, the user, as an answer. That's not the same thing as a properly interrogated, risk-aware decision. The final thing, and actually the thing which alarms me most as a cognitive specialist, is just the sheer quantity of product of AI. And it's actually, there is no point in human history that we can go back to which gives us an analogy for what is now happening with this sort of tsunami of information, a lot of which is unsorted, random, wrong, made up. um, the human brain actually is not sufficiently evolved to have the skill to critically question the quantity of not fully sorted information that is now being thrown at us. And I think there are two things we need to do in response to that. One is with urgency, teach critical thinking skills in schools. There's only one country in the world where they do that currently, which is Sweden. And the reason that Sweden does it is that they've noticed that their neighbour to the north is sponsoring troll farms, with the active intention of undermining Swedish society. That's not secret, by the way. There's plenty of public coverage of this. But uniquely, the Swedish government seems to have recognised that the way to deal with that kind of information warfare is to educate your teenage population to interrogate a message. Who's saying this? Where does it come from? Why is it addressed to me? Why would I trust the messenger? Are any other sources saying this? Can I triangulate it against any other sort of, it's the simplest things like you and I. Do we get our news from the same source always? So I don't know about you. I have the BBC. I've got the Reuters news ticker. I look at the socials from time to time. You can learn a surprising amount from social media as well. But my worry is, um, people under the age of, let's say, 20, certainly under the age of 15, now acquire their news almost entirely from social media and specifically from TikTok and things like that, where there is no critical interrogation of the news going through. It's very much people kind of swarming around story ideas. Now, say what you like about old school news proprietors and the intervention of proprietorial owners in newspaper titles or whatever. At least when we had investigative journalism as a sort of institution of news gathering, we had interrogation of the quality of stories. And okay, different news titles, Fox News has a different view from CNN and so on. And of course, you get editorial intervention from owners, but generally, old school investigative journalism gave us a clearer filter, a clearer interrogation of what was true and what was not. What we're now finding with sort of highly partisan news gathering, and particularly with the socials, is that there's no attempt at critique at all. And to go back to AI, I think when all of that is harnessed and kind of shoved through the AI funnel without any critical appraisal, the sheer quantity of data, I'm not going to call it information, it's just, stuff going through, is far greater than the human collective mind can assimilate. So, the very first thing we need is education on critical thinking. Hard on the heels of that, some kind of nation state or global intervention. Maybe it's something like nuclear safety. We need an equivalent of the Atomic Energy Authority on a global basis to critique the application of AI. Really, it is that fundamental to humanity that we get this right. So it's a
Yeah,
huge
great.
question, Steve, that I can't answer in more than maybe 3 or 4 minutes here of just
No, no,
kind of
no, no, no.
kicking the ball around. But as a cognitive scientist, I see this as a fundamental threat to human collective cognition. It's also, of course, a wonderful opportunity, but we haven't got the guardrails around it sufficiently yet to get the best of the opportunity without the destruction. And it bothers me. I sit on a couple of think tanks where we're putting together, framing of regulation and legislation for this. And I think the classical pattern of regulation legislation is that it tends to lag behind technology by about a decade. I don't think we've got a decade before, serious stuff starts going wrong.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, Roger. Conscious of time, so there's two last things I'd like to ask you about. One is related, and you've kind of weaved this through actually all the way through, and obviously for us at Blend, it's all about that access to diversity of thinking. With the AI, with the increasing risks that we have in industry, just talk to me a little bit about why it's so important for leaders to be searching more broadly or more diversely to access different thinking in this current climate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lovely question. Thank you very much. That's kind of an open goal, as you know, for one of my favorite topics. Um, I think there are three qualities of leadership that we can sum up as being absolutely key, particularly in this new age of, vast and semi-structured information, unsorted information. The first one I've kind of referred to sideways, but I've not used the technical term. Let's just use the jargon term for half a minute. It's metacognition. So metacognition, horrible word, I know, is actually quite easy to detect in an organization. It's the ability to think about thinking, and particularly it's the ability to recognize that your own knowledge has limits. The quick test for metacognition is to sit in the board meeting and look around the table and say, so ladies and gents, put a hand up if you have yourself used or heard used the phrase, I don't know, in this meeting or in any of the work you've been doing maybe over the last couple of weeks. How many hands go up? Very few. So I don't know, and I don't mean a chaotic, oh, I don't know, not a kind of shrugging. I don't. It's I don't know, but actually that's why we should look at this. It does take a certain amount of courage as a leader to say, actually, I don't know, and the fact that I don't know concerns me because it's important that we find out. So closely linked to that is this idea of psychological safety, which I know everyone's talking about at the moment, and certainly the regulators in my field. By psychological safety, we don't just mean making people feel comfortable. It's actually it's in the pursuit of a much bigger goal, which is that we want to be a learning organization. So we want like I was saying about, I don't know, half an hour ago, why do you hire all these expensive people and then operate with their brains running at like 10% of capacity? Why don't we unlock all of that extra capacity for ethical thinking, for encounters, for being sentient and, recognizing differences of opinion and properly discussing why we differ about things. And that then brings me to the third aspect of this, which is you just mentioned it, cognitive diversity, which is not kind of scorecard ticking diversity. And obviously, diversity of any kind is useful to get us thinking better. But cognitive is recognizing that people have different ways of understanding problems and solving them. So you should be able to get a working group together to solve any given problem in an organization where you're drawing on different lived experiences such that people see the problem in different ways. I've actually got a gadget at this point which I can show you. Forgotten that I had one of these on my desk. So here we are against this blue background. So you could argue that this is a square box, right? Or you could argue that it's a triangle. Or you could argue that it's a circle. Of course, the truth is it's actually quite a complex object. When you rotate it in space, you can see that it has many different aspects. And so looking at it in only one dimension, seeing it as that like one-dimensional triangle, or seeing it as that one-dimensional square or that one-dimensional circle, it's not wrong, but it's not the whole picture. What we need to do is get used to problem solving by bringing to the table people who have different angles of approach. And that, in plain terms, or as plain as I can put it, is the concept of cognitive diversity. So a good leader understands the limits of their own knowledge, welcomes differences of opinion or different perspectives, and gives people the safety to challenge and examine and experiment. And again, as one of the big writers on psychological safety, Amy Edmondson, says, if you're doing an experiment which has a certain outcome, you know what this test is going to do, you probably haven't made it an unsafe enough, a risky enough experiment. In fact, it's not really an experiment if you know the exact outcome that's going to come from it. You want a bit of uncertainty. You want the possibility of failure in order that, having failed, you can learn how to do something better next time. But organizations which suppress discussion about failure, unfortunately, also suppress intelligent questioning. And that's when they tend to sort of dive off a cliff and the brand fails.
Roger, I love that. We've, of course, the podcast is called Fall Forward, and we've got to the failure question and risk at perfect timing. So well done, and thank you for that. And I love the visual representation of the thing that we're embodying here at Blend. So thank you for that also. My last question
We
for
should,
you
well, maybe
is,
it's the first half a dozen intelligent questions that come on from this podcast. I will happily send one of these multi gadgets too. Why don't we do
well,
that?
there we go. We'll hold you to that. Thank you. My last question to you is something we ask all our guests on the podcast, which is a recommendation, something that helps you as a leader, helps you as a person. It could be a book, it could be a thing you do, it could be frankly anything, but a recommendation for our listeners to enrich their perhaps approach to risk or life or being
Absolutely.
a leader.
So, yeah, I do a session on, cognitively diverse thinking and leadership skills and this sort of thing. I think, let me do two things. So I recommend to people books about the lives of people who've lived lives fundamentally unlike yours, or who, because of their life experience, can teach you to maybe just take a step back and reflect. So the book that I recommend to absolutely everybody is Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women, which is all about why is the set of public statistics missing 50% of the data that it needs. So whether that's healthcare, finance, building design, public transport, wherever you look. The other types of book I recommend just very quickly are biographies, autobiographies of people who've led lives that are so fundamentally unlike yours. So my two current favourites are Tara Westover, Educated. So this is a girl who grew up sort of feral on a scrap heap in a survivalist community, didn't go to school till I think the age of 10. She's now a junior professor at Cambridge University. So just an incredible self-discovery. There's a book by a kid called Ismail Bear called A Long Way Gone, and it's the story of a child soldier who survived the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why it's such a good read is that if you are a 10-year-old, AK-47 wielding soldier, going back to that idea of micromorts I talked about at the beginning, your chances of death are unbelievably high. They're like 80%, 90% high. The chances of you being either literate enough or able to escape from that situation and then write your life story are essentially zero. So it's a really important book for understanding, the corruption of states, the production of child armies, the abuse of innocence and all of that stuff that goes on. It's a fascinating read. When you walk around in a big city and you keep your gaze at street level, the streetscape is pretty homogenous, right? It's all these branded shops and outlets and so on. How about you look up occasionally at the tops of buildings? So you learn far more about the history of your environment, particularly in a big city like London or wherever you are, by looking not at all the homogeneously branded shops, like not yet another such and such a coffee shop, but what about the building? What about the setting? What about the development of this street and this neighborhood? Let's think a bit more about context. And you can also, at a micro level, do things like if you jog regularly, if like me, you're a kind of couch to 5K person, vary your route. So never go the same way twice. And actually, even when I'm driving or cycling, I make a point of never taking the exact same route, even from home to the office. Force yourself to look at things differently.
Roger, thank you so
Thanks.
much. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation this morning. And I know our members enjoyed their conversation with you in London last week. So thank you for that also. Love the ending there, reminding us to look up, think broadly, go and find ideas and knowledge in all the places that you don't normally look for it. And I think that's a lovely way to end today's session. So Dr. Roger Moss,
Starting with
thank you so
blend,
much. And
Steve.
of course, starting with Glenn. And we'll see you very soon, Roger. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Make sure you subscribe to the Fall Forward channel so you don't miss any new episodes. I'll see you soon.